My name is Isla Winslow. I'm 36 years old, and for 11 years I've been the person regional pilots trust to tell them the truth about whether their airplane is actually safe to fly, which turns out to be a very useful skill to have when your own father has spent his whole life telling you your job isn't a real one. My father, Graham Winslow, built a trucking company out of one used flatbed and 40 years of getting up before everyone else. And at his 65th birthday gala, in front of the mayor and half his customer list, he announced he was handing Winslow Freight Lines to my brother Tobias, along with a flashy new air cargo division he'd built as his retirement legacy project, and he did it with a toast that mentioned my little hobby fixing engines, the way you'd apologize for a relative who couldn't hold a real job. I didn't argue with him. I smiled, and I clapped, because that's what you do at your father's party. But here's what none of them knew, standing in that hangar with their champagne. The airplane sitting behind my father, under all that string lighting, the one he was about to unveil as the future of his company, had already been inspected, tested, and signed off 6 months earlier by a mechanic he'd never bothered to meet, working out of a business he'd never bothered to learn the name of. That mechanic was me. 6 weeks after that toast, my father would call me twice in 1 week for the first time in 3 years. And 40 minutes after that, in front of every person who mattered to him, he'd find out exactly whose signature was keeping his legacy project in the air. Nobody in that hangar saw any of it coming from quiet, grease-under-her-nails Isla, the daughter who never joined the family business. Welcome back to Calm Stories, where the ones who kept the peace for everyone else finally tell you the whole thing, calmly, start to finish. If you know what it's like to be underestimated by the people who raised you, settle in, drop a comment, and tell me where you're listening from, and hit subscribe. Let me back up. I was 12 the first time my father found me at the kitchen table with a screwdriver and the guts of an old transistor radio spread out on a dish towel so I wouldn't scratch the laminate. It had been my mother's, a boxy little AM/FM thing from her own childhood that had stopped working sometime around when I was 10, and I'd spent 2 weeks of allowance money at the hardware store on Route 4 buying capacitors I only half understood how to test, working off a library book on basic electronics that I kept renewing until the librarian just let me keep it. My father looked at the mess on the table, looked at me, and said, "Not unkindly exactly, just certain. That's a waste of a Saturday, Izzy. That thing's dead. Some things you fix, some things you replace." I got the radio working 4 days later. I didn't tell him. I just kept it on my dresser, playing static soft oldies stations while I did my homework, and I noticed, the way 12-year-olds notice everything, and process none of it until years later, that he never once asked how I'd done it. My mother, Adele, was the one who actually asked. She died 6 years ago, quickly, the kind of cancer that doesn't give a family time to prepare a version of itself for the loss. And I still keep her radio on the workbench in my hangar, plugged in, tuned to the same oldies station, mostly for the 10 minutes some mornings when I need my hands busy and my head quiet before the day's work starts. My father grieved her the way he grieves everything, by working longer hours, and my brother Tobias and I grieved her in the 2 different ways children in that house had always coped with things. He got louder and more agreeable, and I got quieter and more exact. Tobias is 33, 4 years younger than me, and I want to be fair to him before I tell you the rest of this, because he isn't a villain in this story. He's more like weather, that happened to a lot of people at once. He went to business school because it was the obvious next step after growing up the son our father actually talked to about the company. And he spent a decade in sales and business development at Winslow Freight Lines, good at the parts of the job that involve a room and a handshake, never once curious about the parts that involve a torque wrench. He isn't cruel, he's just never had to be curious about me, because nobody ever made him. I went a different way. I enlisted at 18, spent 4 years as an aircraft mechanic in the Air Force, because I wanted my hands on something my father couldn't call a hobby, came home at 22, and spent the next 6 years working my way up through certifications most people outside the industry have never heard of. An airframe and power plant license, then an inspection authorization on top of it, which is the FAA's way of saying you're trusted to be the last word on whether an aircraft is legally allowed to fly. 11 years ago, I opened Cardinal Point Aviation out of a leased hangar at the regional airport, 40 minutes from my father's house, close enough that he could have visited in an afternoon, and far enough, apparently, that he never once did. I want to be precise about something, because it matters for the rest of this story. My father never told me not to become a mechanic. He simply never asked me a single question about it. For 11 years, the way you don't ask questions about something you've already decided isn't worth the conversation. Every family dinner, he asked Tobias about quarterly numbers and new accounts. Every family dinner, he asked me, if he asked me anything, whether I was seeing anyone, and whether the engine thing was still paying my bills. I always said yes to both, because both were true, and because I'd learned a long time ago that correcting my father's version of me cost more than it was worth. He turned 65 that spring, and Tobias, with what I genuinely believe was good intention, planned a gala, not a family dinner. A gala in an actual hangar my father had rented at the regional airport, with string lighting and a jazz trio and 80 guests, because my father had decided that his retirement announcement deserved a stage, and the centerpiece of that stage was going to be the unveiling of Winslow Air Freight, a brand new short-haul cargo division he'd been quietly building for 2 years, as what he kept calling his legacy project. Tobias called me himself to describe it, weeks out, genuinely excited in the way he gets about anything with a program and a step-and-repeat banner, walking me through the guest list and the caterer, and the moment, choreographed down to the minute, when the hangar doors would roll open to reveal the aircraft under lights. He asked if I'd come. He never once asked what I did for a living that might be relevant to an airplane unveiling, because it never occurred to him, any more than it had ever occurred to our father, that the two things in that sentence had anything to do with each other. He'd bought a used twin-engine cargo plane for it that spring, a solid, unglamorous workhorse of an aircraft, and he planned to unveil it at the gala under lights, engines started for a photo, the whole thing timed like a product launch. What my father didn't know, because he'd never once asked what business I actually ran, was that 6 months before that gala, a broker looking to move that exact aircraft had hired Cardinal Point Aviation to run the pre-purchase inspection. It's routine work, the kind I do every month. I climbed through that airframe for 2 full days, logged every finding, and signed my name, Isla Winslow, Cardinal Point Aviation, to a report that flagged one open item before the sale could close clean. An airworthiness directive on the left engine's exhaust system, requiring a repeat inspection every 200 flight hours to rule out a specific kind of cracking the FAA had flagged across that engine model years earlier. It's a routine directive. It's also not optional. I filed my report, the sale went through to a buyer I never met, and I forgot about that airplane completely, the way you forget about any of the 400 aircraft you've put your name on over a decade, until my brother sent a mass family text with a rendering of the new Winslow Air Freight logo and a tail number I recognized before I'd even finished reading the message. That same week, I signed off on 3 other jobs at the shop: an annual inspection on a flight instructor's trainer, a landing gear repair on a crop duster that had clipped a fence post, and a pre-buy on a little 4-seater a retired school teacher was finally buying for herself after 40 years of wanting one. None of those owners needed convincing that the work mattered. They just wanted to know, plainly, whether their airplane was safe, and I told them, plainly, because that's the entire job. Not performance, not politics, just the truth about a machine, delivered calmly to someone who actually wants to hear it. I mention it because it's easy, hearing a story like mine, to assume every conversation I have about an aircraft goes the way the ones with my father went. They don't. Most people just want an honest answer. My father wanted a different kind of conversation entirely, one where the facts arranged themselves around what he'd already decided, and it took me 2 phone calls to fully understand he wasn't going to get there on his own. I called my father that same afternoon. I want to tell you exactly how that call went, because it's the choice a lot of you are going to want me to have skipped, and you'd have a point. I told him congratulations, genuinely, because whatever else is true, watching your father build something from one flatbed truck is still watching your father build something. Then I told him I recognized the tail number, that I'd run the pre-buy inspection on that exact aircraft 6 months earlier, and that there was an open compliance item on the left engine that needed to be closed out and documented before he flew it publicly, let alone started the engines for a photo in front of 80 guests. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I actually asked if he was still there. "You inspected this plane," he said, and it wasn't a question, so much as a man trying to make a fact fit somewhere it didn't belong. I told him yes, 6 months ago, under my business, and that if he pulled the maintenance logs he'd find my signature on the pre-buy report. He was quiet again, and then he said, in the voice he uses when he's decided a conversation is over, "The broker's mechanic already signed off on this thing. I don't need you checking someone else's work, Izzy. I've got people for that." I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I wasn't someone else. I was the mechanic. He said he'd look into it, in the tone people use when they have no intention of looking into anything, and got off the phone to take another call. That was the first conversation. I hung up, sat in my hangar office with my mother's radio playing low static soft jazz in the background, and understood, in the specific unhurried way you understand something you've actually known your whole life, that my father was never going to hear me until the fact stood in a room he couldn't leave. If you've ever tried to tell someone in your own family something true and watched them decide, in real time, that you must be wrong simply because of who you are to them, stay with me. This gets worse before it gets right. Drop a comment and hit subscribe so the ending finds you too. I called him again 4 days later because the compliance clock doesn't care how a conversation went the first time, and because some part of me, I'll admit, wanted him to ask me one real question about my work before I let this go. I told him the inspection interval didn't reset itself just because he didn't want to hear about it, and that flying the aircraft publicly with an open, undocumented directive wasn't just bad optics if anyone ever checked. It was the kind of thing that shows up on an insurance claim in exactly the worst possible way if something ever went wrong on that engine. He told me Tobias had already looked into the insurance and everything was handled. I asked, gently, whether Tobias knew what an airworthiness directive was. My father said, and I remember this exactly because it's the sentence that finally, fully, told me something I'd been circling for 20 years. "You've always had to make everything difficult, Izzy. Some of us are actually trying to build something." I didn't have an answer for that one. I said okay, and I meant a very different okay than the one he heard, and I hung up. I sat with that sentence for 3 days before I told anyone. My niece Piper, who's 10, and Tobias's daughter, was the one who actually pulled me out of it, in the way children do without meaning to. She'd been spending Saturday afternoons at my hangar for about a year by then, ever since she found a broken alarm clock in her school's Lost and Found, and asked, completely unprompted, whether I could teach her to fix it. I could, we did. Since then, most Saturdays, she shows up in coveralls 2 sizes too big, and I let her hand me tools and ask 100 questions I answer honestly, because nobody had ever done that for me, and I'd decided a long time ago, without quite announcing it to myself, that I was going to be the adult who did it for her. That particular Saturday, she was turning an old radio of her own over in her hands, one I'd picked up for $1 at an estate sale, specifically because it reminded me of my mother's, and she asked me why grown-ups decide some things are worth fixing and other things aren't. I didn't have a clean answer for a 10-year-old. I told her the truth instead, which is that some grown-ups decide what's worth fixing, based on what it looks like from the outside, and some decide based on whether it actually works, and that those are 2 completely different questions that get confused for each other all the time. She thought about that for a while, the way she thinks about everything, entirely seriously, turning the little radio over once more like she was checking her own work, and then she said, "Grandpa doesn't think your job is a real job. Dad said so." I asked her, carefully, what she thought a real job was. She shrugged, the enormous, unbothered shrug of a 10-year-old who hasn't yet learned to perform certainty she doesn't feel, and said, "I think it's real if it fixes something." I told her my job was real enough to keep 400 airplanes in the air over the last decade, and that was the last either of us said about it that day. But I noticed something in myself that afternoon, watching her turn that little radio over in her hands, with the same careful attention I used to give my mother's. I wasn't waiting for my father to notice anymore. I'd stopped, somewhere between that second phone call and that Saturday, needing him to. That's not a small thing to say out loud, even now. My whole life, without ever quite naming it, I'd been doing good work, partly in the hope that eventually, the pile of it would get tall enough for my father to see over whatever he'd already decided about me. Watching Piper turn that radio over, I understood I didn't need the pile to get any taller. I already knew what my work was worth. I just hadn't said so, out loud, to anyone who needed to hear it, in a very long time. I didn't cry, and I didn't call my father to announce anything. I just closed up the hangar that evening, went home, and started closing out the compliance inspection on that engine myself, quietly, on my own schedule, not because he'd asked, and not to prove anything to him. I did it because grounding a man's airplane out of spite was never who I wanted to be, and because somewhere in me, doing the work right, whether he ever knew it or not, had become the entire point. I want to tell you about a small thing I chose not to do, because it matters more than it looks like it should. I could have called Tobias directly and told him everything, weeks before the gala, and let him carry the news to our father himself, the way he'd always carried everything else between us. I thought about it for almost a full day. Instead, I decided to wait and see whether my father would ask a single follow-up question on his own. Without me pushing, in the 6 weeks between that second phone call and the gala. He never did, not once. He mentioned the aircraft twice more in family group texts, both times about the champagne order and the photographer's timeline, never once about the maintenance file sitting untouched in his own office. I didn't chase it, I just quietly finished my own paperwork, filed it properly, and waited for the gala the way you wait for a fact to become unavoidable on its own schedule instead of yours. I flew the fix myself, on a gray Tuesday 2 weeks before the party, out at the airport with nobody watching, torqued the repair down to spec, ran the engine through its full test cycle, and logged the compliance closure in the aircraft's permanent records under Cardinal Point Aviation, the same business name that had been sitting unread in my father's files for 6 months. I signed it with the same steady hand I sign everything, and I didn't tell a single member of my family that it was done. Some proof, I've learned running this shop, only means something when somebody else discovers it standing right in front of them. I want to be honest about something, because it would have been easy to tell this story a different way. I could have done nothing. I could have let that engine sit open and undocumented, let my father wheel it out under string lighting with a compliance violation, quietly ticking away in the background, and let the consequences land on him however they landed, publicly, painfully, in front of everyone he was trying to impress. Some part of me, in the ugliest hour of that week, considered exactly that. I didn't do it, and not because I'm a better person than the version of me that briefly wanted to. I didn't do it because grounding a man's airplane out of spite was never who I actually wanted to be, and because the job itself doesn't care how angry I am at the person who signed the check. An aircraft is either airworthy or it isn't. I wasn't going to let my father's opinion of me decide which one that plane got to be. What none of them understood, watching my father build his gala around a photo of engines starting, was that he wasn't really building a legacy project at all. I want to give him that understanding now, because I've had 6 weeks to sit with it and it's true, even if it doesn't excuse anything. My father grew up the son of a man who thought 2 working hands and a stubborn back were the only honest currency there was. and he spent his whole life proving himself against that measuring stick, one flatbed truck at a time, until pride and work became the same muscle in him, and he genuinely couldn't tell the difference between loving his children and needing them to prove something on his behalf, in a language he understood. Tobias spoke that language. I never did, not because I couldn't, but because I'd found a different one that made just as much sense to me, and my father never once tried to learn it. You can understand exactly why a man became who he is, and still, calmly, decline to keep shrinking yourself to fit inside his version of you. I've spent 11 years keeping other people's airplanes honest. I wasn't about to spend the rest of my life keeping his opinion of me comfortable instead. We're getting close to the gala now, and I promise you it doesn't end the way a story like this usually does. If this is landing anywhere close to home, drop a comment and subscribe, and let's get to that hangar. I almost didn't go. I want to admit that to you, because it's true, and because I think a lot of you have stood in a driveway in a dress you didn't quite want to wear, keys in hand, deciding whether a family event was worth the version of yourself it always seemed to require. I went anyway, partly because Piper had made me promise, the week before, that I'd save her a seat and let her stand next to me when the engines started. I wore the good dress. I did my hair. I told myself, the whole drive out to the airport, that I was simply going to be a supportive daughter for one evening, and that whatever I knew about that aircraft could stay quietly folded in my purse alongside a copy of the maintenance file I'd brought, almost on instinct, the way you bring an umbrella on a day that only might rain. The hangar, when I walked in, was already half full. Caterers moving through the crowd with trays of the good champagne. My father's business contacts, in their best suits, admiring the aircraft under its spotlight like it was a sculpture. The jazz trio working through something warm and forgettable near the bar. My father found me near the entrance, kissed my cheek, told me I looked lovely, and moved on to the next handshake before I'd finished saying thank you, which was, if I'm honest, exactly the greeting I'd expected. I found Tobias by the aircraft, practically vibrating with pride, and I let him walk me through the specs he'd memorized for the occasion, cargo capacity and range, and a paint scheme he was clearly proud of, and I said all the right things, because none of it was a lie, exactly. It was a beautiful airplane. It was also, quietly, mine to vouch for, in a way nobody in that hangar yet understood. The night of the party, the hangar looked like something out of a magazine, string lighting strung across the rafters, a jazz trio near the makeshift bar. The new aircraft parked under its own spotlight with a ribbon looped, absurdly, around the nose wheel. My father gave his toast around 9, thanking Tobias, thanking his customers, thanking 40 years of getting up before everyone else, and then, almost as an aside, gesturing loosely in my direction with his champagne glass, he thanked Izzy, who's kept herself busy with her little hobby fixing engines all these years, bless her, and the room laughed, warmly, the way rooms laugh at things they've been told are funny by someone they respect. I smiled. I clapped. Tobias beside me didn't quite meet my eyes, and I understood, watching him not look at me, that some part of him already suspected the joke had landed somewhere it shouldn't have. The plan was simple. Unveil the aircraft, start the engines briefly for the cameras, cut the ribbon. What nobody had accounted for was Pete Castellan, a retired regional airport manager and an old friend of my father's from 30 years back, who'd been invited as a guest and who happened to actually know something about aircraft maintenance records. As the ground crew prepped for the engine start, Pete, holding his drink, asked my father, entirely casually, whether the pre-buy inspection had cleared the exhaust AD before the sale, because he'd heard that engine model had a run of them a few years back. It was a small, technical, completely unglamorous question. It was also, in that room full of people who understood nothing about aviation maintenance and everything about my father's confidence, the only question that mattered. My father laughed it off at first, said everything was handled, the way he always says everything's handled. Pete, gently, the way old friends push on things younger men wouldn't dare to, asked whether he could see the logbook before they started the engines, just so nobody's insurance has a bad night. I watched my father's face do something I'd never once seen it do in 36 years. Hesitate, in public, in front of people whose opinion he'd spent his whole life managing. He didn't know where the logbook was, he didn't know if the item was closed. He genuinely did not know, standing under his own string lighting, whether the centerpiece of his legacy project was legally airworthy. He asked Tobias, quietly, urgently, whether the file was in the office trailer, and Tobias, who had no idea what an airworthiness directive even was, just shook his head and said he'd have someone check, and I watched the two of them realize, in real time, in front of 80 people, that neither of them actually knew. I walked over. I didn't make a scene of it. I told him, quietly, that I could pull the maintenance file because I happened to have a copy folded in my purse, the way I always keep copies of every job I've signed off, and I asked whether he'd like me to check it in front of everyone or just tell him privately. He looked at me for a long moment, in front of 80 people who'd gone very interestingly quiet, and said, tightly, "Just tell me." I told him the AD had been open at time of purchase, exactly as I'd told him 6 weeks earlier on the phone, and that it had since been closed, properly, inspected and documented by Cardinal Point Aviation 2 weeks ago. I watched him do the math out loud, in his own face, before he said it. "That's your shop." I told him it was. I told him I'd signed the original pre-buy report in February and the compliance closure 2 weeks ago, and that both were in the aircraft's permanent file if he or Pete or the FAA or his insurance underwriter ever wanted to see them, because that's the whole point of a permanent file. It doesn't care who's throwing the party. Nobody said anything for a moment. Pete, to his credit, let out a low, delighted whistle and said something about how he always did like a plot twist with his champagne. My father's face did the thing faces do when a fact refuses to rearrange itself into anything more comfortable. The exact expression I imagine I'd have worn if a routine job 400 aircraft ago had turned out 6 months later to matter more than almost anything else I'd signed my name to that year. Tobias, beside him, said, quietly, mostly to himself, "Wait. That's your shop?" Like he was hearing the sentence for the first time, even though I'd told the whole family the same thing weeks before. In a group text, nobody had bothered to read past the first line. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would have felt good, and I still didn't do it. I told my father the aircraft was airworthy, that he was welcome to start the engines and cut his ribbon, and that the only thing I wanted, standing there in a ruined cocktail dress under his string lighting, was for him to understand that the daughter he'd toasted as a hobbyist 20 minutes earlier was the reason his legacy project was safe to put his name on at all. He didn't apologize. I want to tell you he did, because it would make a better ending, but I promised myself I'd tell you this the way it actually happened, and my father has never once apologized to me in 36 years, and he didn't start that night. He just nodded, once, and said, "Start the engines," and walked toward the aircraft to have his photo taken, and the party, after a beat, found its rhythm again around him. Here's the accounting, because you've stayed with me this long, and you've earned it. Pete Castellan tracked me down before he left that night and asked for my card, and Cardinal Point Aviation has done 3 inspections for airports and operators in his old network since, entirely on his word, which is worth more in this industry than any advertising I could have bought. One of those jobs, a pre-buy on a small charter operator's second aircraft, closed last week, and the owner told me, almost in passing, that Pete had described me to him as the mechanic who doesn't blink. I've decided I like that description more than almost anything anyone's ever called me. Tobias called me 2 days after the gala, quietly, without our father on the line, and asked if I'd walk him through what an airworthiness directive actually was, because he'd realized, standing in that hangar, that he'd been about to run an aviation division without understanding the first thing about the aircraft in it. We've had coffee twice since then, and the second time, he brought a legal pad and took actual notes, which is a small thing, but it's the first time in either of our adult lives that my brother has asked me to teach him something instead of the other way around. My father hasn't apologized, not in the 6 weeks since, and I've stopped waiting for the specific sentence. The way I stopped waiting for it the Saturday I watched Piper turn that little radio over in her hands. But 3 weeks after the gala, he showed up at my hangar on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, stood in the doorway for a while before he said anything, and finally asked, nodding at my mother's old radio still playing low on the workbench, whether I'd ever gotten around to fixing that thing from the kitchen table. I told him I had, years ago. He nodded again, said it sounded good, and stayed for 20 minutes, asking surface-level questions about the shop that weren't quite an apology, and weren't quite nothing either. What a torque wrench was actually for, how long I'd had my inspection authorization, whether the work ever scared me. I answered every question honestly, the way I answer everyone's, and when he left, he shook my hand at the door the way he shakes a customer's hand, which is not the gesture I wanted from him, and is, for now, the only one he seems to have. I've decided to let that be enough for now, not because it fully is, but because I'd rather leave a door cracked than slam it shut on a man who's clearly never been taught how to walk through one properly. Piper still comes by most Saturdays. Last week, she finished rewiring that dollar store radio entirely on her own, no help from me past handing her the right screwdriver when she asked, and when it crackled to life, she looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because I'd worn it myself at exactly her age, standing at a kitchen table with a dish towel under a mess nobody else in the house believed was worth the mess. She asked if I was proud of her. I told her I was, and then I told her the part I actually wanted her to keep, that she didn't need me to be proud of her for the radio to have worked, because it had already worked, on its own, the second she finished the last connection, whether anyone was standing there to see it or not. That's what my mother never quite got the chance to tell me often enough, and what my father, even now, still hasn't fully learned to say. The thing works because you made it work, and that's the whole answer, and it doesn't need anyone else's permission to count. Competence doesn't ask a room for permission to matter. It just keeps the engines running, whether anyone in that room ever bothers to say thank you.